extend the Affordable Care Act enhanced premium tax credits. But what do House Republicans propose instead? A collection of failed policies that would raise prices, leaving an additional 100,000 people without insurance and restricting access to abortion care, setting the stage for a national abortion ban. But I believe it's my job to offer solutions to help the American people, and specifically my constituents in Ohio. That's why I propose an amendment to remove the section responsible for increasing costs and limiting access to reproductive health care. Right now, any and all abortion coverage provided under marketplace plans are not paid for by the federal dollars. However, this bill would impose unprecedented restrictions on private dollars and is yet another Republican attempt to ban reproductive health care coverage across this country. It is unacceptable that Congress is about to head home having done nothing to protect the millions of Americans who will lose coverage on January 1st.
You just watched Representative Emilia Sykes of Ohio stand on that floor and deliver a speech that should be echoing through every single congressional hallway and television screen in this nation, because what she just exposed is not simply legislative malpractice or partisan gridlock, it is the methodical dismantling of bodily autonomy wrapped in the false rhetoric of fiscal responsibility and healthcare reform. And this is the moment where we need to understand with absolute crystalline clarity that what House Republicans are doing right now in December 2025 is executing a strategy so insidious, so carefully choreographed, that it makes the backroom deals of the Gilded Age look like amateur hour at a community theater. The House GOP released legislation that would exclude health plans providing abortion coverage, and you need to understand that this is happening right now as we speak, as millions of Americans are about to lose their enhanced ACA subsidies on January 1st, and the Republicans are holding health care hostage to impose what Senator Ron Wyden called a backdoor national abortion ban. And I need you to stay with me here, because what is about to unfold in your understanding is going to fundamentally reshape how you see this entire political battle. The enhanced premium tax credits that Representative Sykes is fighting to extend, these are not abstract policy provisions, these are the financial mechanisms that have allowed millions of working families to afford health care coverage through the Affordable Care Act marketplaces, and when these subsidies expire in precisely 2 weeks, individuals who purchase health insurance through ACA marketplaces will see steep premium rises by thousands of dollars a month beginning next year. And this is not hypothetical, this is not fear-mongering, this is mathematical certainty, unless Congress acts immediately. But here is where the plot thickens into something far more sinister than mere legislative dysfunction, because Senate Republicans say they're open to extending these ACA funds, but only if Democrats acquiesce to stricter abortion restrictions on insurance plans, and we need to pause right here and recognize what is actually being proposed because the framing matters desperately in this moment. Behind the push is a pressure campaign by Susan B. Anthony Pro-Life America, an influential group fighting to ban abortion in the U.S., to condition Republican support for ACA funding on tougher abortion restrictions, and this organization has made it absolutely clear any extension of these ACA subsidies would extend funding of elective abortion coverage through Obamacare, and that a vote for this extension is a vote for abortion coverage, which is a deliberate and calculated misrepresentation of existing law, because here comes the bombshell that should make your blood pressure spike into the stratosphere. The ACA already has specific language that applies Hyde Amendment restrictions to the use of premium tax credits, limiting them to using federal funds to pay for abortions only in cases that endanger the life of the woman, or that are a result of rape or incest, which means that federal dollars are already prohibited from funding abortion services under the existing framework, and the ACA also explicitly allows states to bar all plans participating in the state marketplace from covering abortions, which 25 states have done since the ACA was signed into law in 2010. So when Representative Sykes stands on that floor and says that any and all abortion coverage provided under marketplace plans are not paid for by federal dollars, she is stating an incontrovertible fact that Republicans are deliberately obscuring in order to manufacture a crisis that allows them to impose restrictions that go far beyond anything currently in place. What the GOP is demanding is not enforcement of existing Hyde Amendment protections. What they are demanding is the effective elimination of private insurance coverage for abortion services by telling insurance companies they can no longer receive vital federal funding if they provide abortion coverage under their plans, giving insurance providers an enormous incentive to weaken their abortion coverage or drop it completely. And this distinction between public and private dollars is absolutely critical to understanding the totalitarian scope of what is being proposed here. We are talking about the federal government using its market power to coerce private insurance companies into eliminating a legal medical service from their coverage options, which represents a breathtaking expansion of state control over private commercial decisions in service of ideological purity. Right now, 25 states either require or permit abortion coverage under ACA plans, and depending on how far along your pregnancy is, abortions can cost anywhere from $600 to $2,000 out of pocket, and insurance coverage can make the difference between someone having an abortion or being forced to remain pregnant, which means that what Republicans are proposing would functionally eliminate abortion access for millions of people who live in states where the procedure remains legal, not through direct prohibition, but through financial strangulation. And this is the genius and the horror of their strategy, because it allows them to claim they are simply enforcing existing restrictions, while actually constructing a nationwide barrier to access that operates regardless of state law. By eliminating federal cost-sharing for plans that include abortion coverage, Trump and congressional Republicans are putting up barriers to abortion in states where this care is still legal, and their ultimate goal is to put abortion care out of reach for everyone, everywhere, under every circumstance. And we need to name this for exactly what it is. This is not states' rights. This is not federalism. This is a national ban achieved through economic coercion rather than statutory prohibition. The political evolution of this strategy reveals everything you need to know about Republican bad faith on this issue, because let us travel back through the recent historical record and watch how the rhetoric has shifted while the underlying objective has remained utterly constant. House Republicans are abandoning a years-long push by their party to pass a federal abortion ban, and in interviews with dozens of Republicans, the vast majority rejected the idea of Congress pursuing a national ban and said leadership has no plans for it to be a centerpiece of their agenda. And this pivot happened not because of any genuine commitment to state autonomy, but because Republicans acknowledged that the abortion ruling hurt the GOP in the midterm elections, and they're worried about a similar backlash in 2024. The calculation here is nakedly electoral, and this is the first time in 40 years that the RNC has not explicitly endorsed a national ban on abortion in the platform, representing what appears on the surface to be a dramatic moderation, but what actually functions as a strategic retreat to more defensible political terrain from which to launch the same assault through different mechanisms. Donald Trump himself has been the avatar of this cynical repositioning, repeatedly claiming that abortion should be left to the states, while simultaneously appointing the Supreme Court justices who overturned Roe, and enabling exactly the kind of federal interference we are witnessing right now in this ACA negotiation. It was never about leaving it up to the states. That was always convenient rhetoric that would allow these Republican leaders to get elected and then push their anti-abortion agenda through Congress. The sophistication of this deception cannot be overstated, because it allows Republicans to campaign on a message of restraint and federalism while governing with the full authoritarian impulse to impose a singular moral vision on an entire nation through whatever procedural mechanisms present themselves. And what we are seeing in December 2025 is the fulfillment of that strategy as Republicans hold healthcare funding hostage to advance restrictions that would never pass as standalone legislation. But wait, because there is another layer to this nightmare scenario that Representative Sykes is trying to illuminate for anyone paying attention, and that is the deliberate cruelty of the timing and the legislative packaging. Congress is about to leave for the holidays having done nothing, absolutely nothing, to prevent millions of Americans from seeing their healthcare premiums skyrocket on January 1st, and the Republican position is essentially that those millions of people can have affordable healthcare only if the party succeeds in restricting reproductive rights for tens of millions of other people, which is hostage-taking as legislative strategy, and the casual willingness to inflict mass suffering in service of ideological demands should be understood as a form of political terrorism that has become normalized within conservative governance. Time is running out for Congress to act, and once the subsidies for Americans who buy healthcare plans through the ACA expire at the end of the year, millions of Americans' premiums will skyrocket, and House Republicans know this, Senate Republicans know this, and they are using this knowledge as leverage to extract concessions that have nothing to do with the fiscal mechanics of healthcare policy, and everything to do with imposing a religious and ideological vision of reproductive control. The philosophical framework we need to apply here draws directly from the work of theorists who have analyzed how authoritarian movements consolidate power, not through dramatic coups, but through the slow strangulation of rights and the manipulation of democratic processes to produce anti-democratic outcomes. What Republicans are doing with this ACA negotiation is a textbook example of what political scientists call constitutional hardball, where political actors use technically legal mechanisms to achieve outcomes that violate the spirit and intent of democratic governance, and the genius of this approach is that it allows them to claim they are simply engaged in normal legislative negotiation, while actually wielding government power to punish ideological enemies and reward political supporters. The use of must-pass legislation to insert poison pills that restrict fundamental rights is not new. We have seen this playbook deployed on everything from appropriations bills to debt ceiling negotiations, but the brazenness of holding healthcare coverage hostage to reproductive restrictions reveals how completely the Republican Party has abandoned any pretense of governing in the public interest. Representative Sykes mentions that this bill would impose unprecedented restrictions on private dollars, and we need to understand the full implications of this language, because what is unprecedented is not the restriction of federal funding for abortion that has been the law since the Hyde Amendment passed in 1976. What is unprecedented is the federal government using its subsidy programs to dictate what services private insurance companies can offer using privately paid premiums. This represents a fundamental expansion of government interference in private commercial transactions, and the spectacular irony of Republicans, the party that claims to champion free markets and limited government, using state power to restrict private business decisions in service of moral regulation, should not be lost on anyone. This is the same party that screams about government overreach when discussing environmental regulations or labor protections, but when it comes to controlling women's bodies and reproductive choices, suddenly the heavy hand of federal intervention is not just acceptable, but necessary and urgent. The legislative mechanism they are using reveals the sophistication of the strategy, because rather than proposing a direct ban that would face constitutional challenges and political backlash, they are creating economic incentives that make it financially untenable for insurance companies to offer abortion coverage, which produces the same outcome as a ban without the legal vulnerabilities. This is governance through economic coercion, rather than statutory prohibition, and it is precisely the kind of indirect rights restriction that the Supreme Court's conservative majority has shown itself willing to tolerate and even encourage through decisions like the Dobbs ruling itself, which did not ban abortion, but rather removed federal protection, and created the legal space for state and federal actors to restrict access through whatever means they can devise. The current Republican strategy is to flood that legal space with every conceivable barrier to access, from direct state bans to federal funding restrictions to insurance coverage limitations to medication access constraints, creating a comprehensive architecture of prohibition that operates through 1,000 small restrictions rather than one dramatic ban. Senator Mike Rounds warned that Republicans won't get any votes to extend the money without more stringent abortion limitations, and this unified front reveals how completely the anti-abortion movement has captured the Republican Party apparatus, because even senators from states that have voted to protect abortion rights are willing to hold healthcare funding hostage to impose restrictions that their own constituents oppose. The political calculation here is that the anti-abortion base is more organized, more motivated, and more likely to punish defection than the broader public that supports abortion rights, and this calculus has driven Republican policy for decades. But what we are seeing now is the endgame of that strategy, as Republicans realize they may never have a better opportunity to impose their vision, while they control the House and can force Democrats into impossible choices between protecting healthcare subsidies and protecting reproductive rights. The historical parallels here are chilling, because we have seen this pattern before in American history, where conservative movements used periods of political control to impose maximalist agendas that constrained rights for generations, and the Reconstruction era offers a particularly instructive example. After the Civil War, when the federal government briefly committed to protecting the rights of freed slaves through constitutional amendments and enforcement legislation, the withdrawal of that federal protection in the Compromise of 1877 allowed Southern states to construct elaborate systems of oppression through Jim Crow laws that operated for nearly a century, and the mechanism was similar to what we are seeing now with abortion, where instead of explicitly re-enslaving Black Americans, which would have been politically and legally impossible, Southern governments created comprehensive systems of economic, social, and political restriction that achieved similar subordination through indirect means. The Republican approach to abortion in 2025 follows this same playbook, where the direct prohibition that they claim to reject is replaced with a comprehensive architecture of restriction that produces the same practical outcome while maintaining a veneer of federalism and respect for state autonomy. Representative Sykes is standing on that floor offering an amendment to remove the provisions that would restrict abortion coverage, and she is doing this knowing that it will fail, knowing that her Republican colleagues will vote it down, but doing it anyway because it forces them to go on record supporting restrictions that most Americans oppose, and this is the work of opposition politics in an era of authoritarian minority rule. Democrats say there's no way they'll agree to stricter abortion limitations, with Senator Jeanne Shaheen responding with a flat no when asked if Democrats would agree to stricter abortion limitations in order to extend the ACA funds, calling it a non-starter. And this principled refusal to negotiate over fundamental rights is exactly the stance that progressives should demand from their representatives, because the alternative is a slow retreat where rights are traded away piece by piece in exchange for temporary policy victories that will be reversed the moment Republicans regain full control. The cynicism of the Republican position becomes even more apparent when you understand that Democrats objected to language in the Senate GOP bill that would have put restrictions on abortion and gender-affirming care, revealing how these healthcare negotiations are being used as vehicles to advance the entire conservative social agenda. And this is the omnibus approach to culture war governance, where every piece of legislation becomes an opportunity to insert restrictions on marginalized communities and contested rights. The Republicans are not even pretending that these abortion restrictions are necessary for the fiscal integrity of the ACA, or have anything to do with healthcare costs or coverage numbers. They are simply using the leverage created by the expiring subsidies to impose ideological demands that could never pass through regular legislative order. And this is what governance by crisis looks like, where normal democratic deliberation is replaced by hostage situations and ultimatums. We need to talk about who gets hurt by this strategy, because it is not abstract policy considerations, it is actual human beings who will see their healthcare costs surge and their reproductive options disappear, and the cruelty is not incidental, it is central to the political project. Some Republicans have warned that ending ACA subsidies could cost their party the midterm elections, citing worried communications from their constituents, which means that even Republicans understand that these policies are deeply unpopular and will cause real harm to their own voters, but they are willing to absorb that political cost in exchange for advancing the anti-abortion agenda, and this reveals the hierarchy of priorities within the conservative movement, where controlling women's reproduction ranks above the economic well-being of their own electoral coalition. The people who will be most harmed by the elimination of enhanced subsidies are working-class families in red and purple states who have used these credits to afford marketplace coverage, and the people who will be most harmed by the elimination of abortion coverage from private insurance are women without the resources to travel to states with fewer restrictions or pay out of pocket for services, and the overlap between these populations is substantial, which means that Republican policy is deliberately targeting the most economically vulnerable people for a dual assault on both their healthcare access and their reproductive autonomy. This is class warfare disguised as culture war, and we need to be absolutely clear about this dynamic, because the rhetorical framing around abortion often obscures the economic dimensions of reproductive restriction. When insurance coverage for abortion is eliminated, wealthy women can still access services by paying out of pocket or traveling to wherever care is available, but working class and poor women lose that option entirely, and this is by design, not accident, because the conservative vision of social order has always depended on controlling the reproduction of subordinated classes while allowing elite autonomy. The Republican Party has become the vehicle for this vision of hierarchical social control, where rights and freedoms are distributed unequally based on race, class, and gender, and what we are witnessing in this ACA negotiation is the machinery of that project operating in real time. Representative Sykes represents Ohio, a state that voted in 2023 to protect abortion rights through a ballot measure, and yet her Republican colleagues from that same state are working to undermine that democratic expression of popular will through federal policy, which tells you everything you need to know about the Republican commitment to states' rights and federalism. When states produce outcomes that conservatives support, suddenly state autonomy is sacred and inviolable, but when states protect rights that conservatives oppose, suddenly federal intervention becomes necessary and urgent, and this selective application of federalist principles reveals that the underlying commitment is not to any coherent theory of governance, but simply to achieving conservative policy outcomes through whatever means are available. The principle is not the point, the power is the point, and the use of healthcare funding as leverage to restrict abortion access demonstrates how thoroughly the Republican Party has abandoned even the pretense of principled governance in favor of raw will to power. What makes this moment so dangerous is that it represents a test case for how far Republicans can push this strategy of using must-pass legislation to insert culture war provisions that have nothing to do with the underlying policy, and if they succeed in this instance, if they manage to force Democrats to accept abortion restrictions in exchange for healthcare subsidies, it will establish a precedent that every future legislative negotiation can be held hostage to ideological demands. This is how democratic governance dies, not through dramatic coups, but through the steady erosion of norms and the weaponization of routine legislative processes, and the Republicans are showing us exactly how they intend to govern if they regain full control of Congress and the presidency. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act includes provisions that would cut Medicaid funds to organizations that provide abortions, including Planned Parenthood. This could force nearly 200 Planned Parenthood health centers to shutter, and more than 1.1 million patients could lose access to care, and this is nothing more than an attempt to end abortion in the United States by taking away birth control, cancer screenings, STI testing and treatment, which reveals the comprehensive nature of the assault on reproductive healthcare infrastructure. The representative is right to call this unacceptable, but we need language that is even stronger than unacceptable, because what is happening here is a fundamental betrayal of democratic governance and human rights, and the fact that it is happening through procedural manipulation rather than honest legislative debate makes it more insidious, not less. This is what fascism looks like in a democratic system, where the forms of democracy are maintained while the substance is systematically hollowed out, where elections still happen, but the range of possible policy outcomes is constrained by institutional manipulation and minoritarian control, where rights exist on paper but are made inaccessible through economic and bureaucratic barriers. The Republican strategy on abortion is a masterclass in authoritarian governance within democratic institutions, and if we do not recognize it as such and respond with appropriate urgency, we will wake up one day to discover that the right to abortion has been eliminated, not through dramatic prohibition, but through 1,000 small restrictions that made it impossible to access. So when you watch Representative Emilia Sykes deliver that speech, understand that you are watching someone trying to sound the alarm about a strategy that is unfolding right now, in real time, as Congress prepares to leave millions without affordable health care and uses that crisis to impose reproductive restrictions that will affect tens of millions more. This is not normal political negotiation. This is not legitimate legislative compromise. This is hostage-taking in service of an authoritarian project to control women's bodies and eliminate reproductive autonomy, and it demands a response that matches the urgency and the scope of the threat. We need mass mobilization. We need political pressure on every single Democratic representative and senator to hold the line against these restrictions. We need to name what is happening here as the backdoor national abortion ban that it is, and we need to build the political power to not just defeat this particular legislative gambit, but to break the structural mechanisms that allow minoritarian rule and hostage-taking to function as governance strategies. The fight for reproductive justice is inseparable from the fight for democratic governance, and this moment reveals that truth with perfect clarity, because what Republicans are doing with this ACA negotiation is using democratic dysfunction to achieve anti-democratic ends. The solution is not better messaging or more effective communication. The solution is structural reform that breaks the power of minority obstruction and makes government responsive to popular majorities rather than ideological extremism, and that means confronting the Senate filibuster, confronting gerrymandering, confronting the Electoral College, confronting every institutional mechanism that allows conservatives to wield power despite losing the popular vote. Representative Sykes is doing the work of resistance within the system, but the system itself is broken, and fixing it requires a political movement that is willing to fight for fundamental transformation rather than incremental adjustment. What you just watched is not an isolated incident. It is a preview of governance under Republican control, where every legislative negotiation becomes an opportunity to advance the culture war agenda, and every must-pass bill becomes a vehicle for restricting rights and punishing enemies. This is the future they are building, and the only thing that can stop it is a political coalition organized around the defense of rights and the expansion of democracy, a coalition that understands that reproductive justice and economic justice and racial justice are all part of the same struggle against hierarchical control and authoritarian governance. Representative Sykes is calling us to action, and the question is whether we will answer that call with the urgency and the commitment that this moment demands, because the alternative is a future where abortion access has been eliminated not through honest democratic debate, but through procedural manipulation and economic coercion, where the forms of democracy persist, but the substance has been drained away, where rights exist on paper but cannot be exercised in practice. That is the future Republicans are building, and this ACA negotiation is one more brick in that wall, and we have to tear it down before it becomes permanent.